Most people have seen something like this, a political compass. This version from Wikipedia splits the world into 4 quadrants based on whether a political region is more authoritarian or libertarian and is more economically left or economically right. There are 2 dimensions, authoritarian libertarian going one way and economic left right going horizontally. There are other versions of this. Smart Vote Australia uses a slightly different version. It does not separate the world into quadrants, but still maps political positions in 2 dimensions, liberal conservative going vertically, and economically left-right going horizontally. I'm Mark Fletcher from the Smart Vote team at the Australian National University, and this video is all about the fun that you can have with these political compasses. But let's start at the start. You might already be familiar with the idea of a political spectrum, or the idea of left-wing and right-wing. That political views exist on some sort of spectrum. Maybe you already identify yourself as left-wing or right-wing. Apparently the idea emerged during the French Revolution. If the nature of politics is for there to be some kind of competition between ideas, there has to be at least one idea in the mix where one group is in favour and the other group opposes. But that one idea is likely to be historically contingent. Thomas Carlyle's account of a left and right was largely about support of the monarchy. Today, it's unlikely that you would use this as a relevant spectrum. Today, it's more common for us to discuss left and right in terms of the preferred economic model of a state. Left-wing means more state intervention in the market. Right-wing means less state intervention in the market. For the moment, ignore how oversimplified the left-right spectrum is here and focus instead on what you can now do with this spectrum. If somebody is at one end and another person is at the other end, it makes intuitive sense that somebody could be in the middle of those views, or maybe slightly to one side or to the other. And that can be meaningful, because what you will find is that there are people in this space who have similar views about what the government should do, in this case regulate the market, even if they do not have precisely the same views about why or how the government should do it. Back at the start of this argument, I said that there was a choice. You didn't have to use economically left and economically right as your spectrum. Instead, depending on your theory of politics, there is a phenomenally huge number of options from which to pick. And you can enter into theory debates about whether or not the spectrum chosen is truly a spectrum. Provided that there is an issue with which people can agree or disagree to varying degrees, you can make a spectrum. At the heart of your decision on what the spectrum should be is your theory about how people think about political difference. One of the examples I skipped through was environment versus industrialization. Now, you can have a big old argument about whether or not this is a real spectrum. Maybe you're mad keen for something that is green industrialization, and that's fine. The underlying question is whether enough people in your population think that there is a spectrum here, and whether the people arguing for green industrialization are a fringe group that are unable to be plotted neatly on the spectrum, or maybe they're in the middle somewhere. But what you really don't want is where there's simply no relationship between the options. So let's get back to an easy example. Even with something that seems as straightforward as state intervention versus free markets, you can find people disputing that this is a real spectrum. Maybe you quibble, as I do, with the understanding of markets, or with free, or with what constitutes state intervention. Importantly, it does not matter. What does matter is that 2 people with roughly the same views as each other would look at the spectrum and say, yep, I'm roughly here between these 2 extremes. Even if person number 2 doesn't get it exactly right, they're in the ballpark of each other. It is not random. By now, you should have a bit of a question on your mind. How do we put people on the political spectrum? In some sense, it would be very easy if this were a Hogwarts-style affair where you put on a hat and it said sternly and solemnly, "Ah yes, Harry, you are a leprechaun." Instead, you can ask people, very simply, where do you reckon you sit on the spectrum? And people can give you a gut feel for where they think they sit. Or you could increase the likelihood that people with similar views to each other will end up in the same ballpark as each other by asking them a series of questions about their beliefs. And the result might not match up with where they thought they would end up, but it actually doesn't matter. What matters is that somebody else can follow the process by which they ended up somewhere on that spectrum. It means that you can be open and transparent about how you compare different respondents. Final magic trick. So far, we have been talking in one dimension. You can go left or right on the spectrum, but not up or down. So how do we break into the second dimension? At this point, we've said that you can have lots of different scales. Each of these is in one dimension, left or right. Let's pick two of them. Of course, we are going to rotate one of these at a 90-degree angle here, but what's important to realize, that's not always entirely obvious, is that you are still reading two independent scales. So it's the vertical coordinate and the horizontal coordinate read separately that gives the final location. It might really be the case when you run this 1,000 times. You discover that the population has a natural fit into clusters, but that natural fit should not be determined by the method, which should also tell you something else about your choice of axis. You can end up in situations where the two axes are very close to each other in meaning. This here is a really blatant case just to illustrate the point. So what do we do to prevent this from occurring? With SmartVote, we made sure that we were really transparent with what we mean by each axis, and you can check our method on the website. The result is that when we say left or right on the SmartMap, we mean something that is clearly different from liberal or conservative. And in fact, when we were coding the algorithm, a lot of time was spent looking at the questions, looking at the answers, and then going back to our precise definitions of these axes to make sure that we were mapping them precisely and rigorously. As a final illustration of the point about choice, here are our friends from SmartVote Luxembourg with their version of SmartMap. You can see that instead of liberal or conservative on the vertical axis, they use more or less integration. So that's it from me today. For more information, check out smartvote.org.au or catch us on Twitter at smartvoteau.